I'm very happy to be here today, of course, for this excellent webinar. And I want to start off by thanking Erin Bird for all of her work organizing the event. And I also want to thank her for her incredible chapter contribution to the Fair Trade Handbook on the fashion industry and what needs to be done to promote sustainability and ethical trade within it. It's really a great chapter. We were just talking about it very briefly in my group. And I can tell you my students loved it a lot this year in my fair trade class, and we got a lot out of the chapter and learned a lot. So I've been asked to provide a bit of a background on the book and the motivation behind it, and also introduce our very excellent speakers today. In some ways, Erin's involvement here with the CFTN, with Fair Trade Calgary, with organizing this event, and with the book is the perfect symbol of the collaborative mission behind the book. The goal was to bring together different voices from fair trade, people with a wide range of experiences and knowledge, from people who are very directly involved in fair trade every day, running organizations and groups, to those focused on policy activism at national and international forums. So from the beginning, we've been driven by the idea of allowing different authors to have their different voices. Now, not everyone in the book agrees on everything, but they all share the common goals of social justice and solidarity. So there are disagreements and agreements in the book. And part of what we wanted to do with this book is to frame it in a way that has meaningful dialogue and discussion. And that's in a world, of course, that there's increasingly a lack of real dialogue and discussion, I think, in this world. Now, I think the nature of the book is really best captured by the authors and the editors that are in the book. So in terms of the editors, I have to quickly say a few words there that I've been very fortunate to work with two really exceptional fair trade advocates with this book. One of them is Zach Gross, who's really an institution in fair trade and in the fair trade scene in Canada, having worked for so many years in so many capacities with many different organizations, all of which led him to receiving Fair Trade Canada's Lifetime Achievement Award. Zach first raised the idea of the book back at a CFTN meeting in 2019. And importantly, what Zach wanted was to showcase what fair trade was about and what it could be about in the broadest sense. So fair trade always has immediate practical goals, but it also has a wider mission around education, global solidarity, and advocacy. And that is not always recognized outside of fair trade and also within fair trade. So we designed the book with this in mind, breaking it into 3 sections. The first part offering lessons about the unfair roots of world trade. The second section is about lessons for action from experienced fair traders. And the final section draws on fair trade to promote a vision for a broader social change. Now, my other co-editor, Sean McHugh, also is a key inspiration for the book. You know, Sean's also an institution in fair trade in Canada. He's been the founder of the CFTN since 2011. Since then, Sean's organized 7 national conferences and numerous other events. And I really can't imagine how much work he's put into fair trade cities and campuses across Canada. Back in 2014, Sean visited me in my office when he was in town and asked me to participate in a CFTN conference. And to be honest, at that point, I had my own vision of fair trade, and I felt it was increasingly out of step with other visions. But Sean is incredibly persuasive. I'm sure many of us know that. And he made me realize there was lots of space for genuine dialogue through fair trade. So through CFTN, Sean created this incredible space where fair traders of all different sorts could get together, exchange ideas, and work towards common goals. And it was these CFTN events that fed the book, both the authors that are in it, the focus of the chapters. And I think because of its roots, it started off as a Canadian fair trade book, but as it developed, I think it became something much more. And I think finally, it's important, of course, to highlight the main goal of the book, which is to expose global trade injustice and demand something more. A goal which I think cuts through every chapter in the book. As I was preparing my notes for this event just last week, some of you might have read in the news about the UN holding its 5th global conference on the elimination of child labor in Durban, South Africa. The latest estimates hold that there are 160 million children participating in child labor globally. This number is on the rise due to the pandemic and the conditions it's created. And there was a call to action at the end of this meeting, which emerged urging the world to act to eliminate child labor by 2025. One important aspect of the call that I think is interesting is that the first of the main pillars in the call is to make decent work available for adults. Now, what always strikes me about this and these kinds of calls is how easy it would be to achieve this goal. After all, we live in a world where the world's richest man this week, Elon Musk, is worth nearly $220 billion. We live in a world where, at a minimum, all it takes is a few extra cents for a coffee or a pair of jeans for the farmer and the worker to receive a living wage, something that many people don't realize. And yet, at the same time, something so basic and relatively straightforward is so difficult for us to achieve in this world. And I think that it is eliminating this gap between what we can readily achieve but consistently fail to do that is the main goal and mission of fair trade and trade justice. So for the remainder of this webinar, we're going to hear from 4 amazing speakers and author contributors and have a discussion with them about their thoughts on the world of fair and unfair trade. And I'm going to introduce them as a group, and then we'll move to them. One of them is Monica Furl, the Senior Coffee Manager with Fair Trade International. Monica has more than 25 years of experience in coffee, beginning with facilitating farmer-to-farmer learning exchanges while living in Central America and Mexico. She worked for many years with Cooperative Coffee as a green coffee buyer, producer relations manager, and director of sustainability, before moving on to her latest job with Fair Trade International. Her work is based on extensive knowledge and experience. She's commented widely on coffee and more recently on coffee and climate change. Monica is a fantastic speaker and has written a wonderful chapter in the handbook on climate justice that raises alarm bells over our insufficient action to combat climate change and offers important and meaningful steps forward. After Monica, we're going to hear from Nelson Camilo Melomaya, a small producer of high quality and certified organic coffee in Cauca, Colombia, with his own brand, Nelson Mellow, in the US market. Nelson is the chair and legal representative of the Organic Producers Association of Cauca. He has been a member of the Latin American and Caribbean Network of Fair Trade Small Producers and Workers. He's worked as the General Secretary for the Colombian Initiative of Small Fair Trade Producers, and currently, he's the past chair of the Small Producer Symbol, the SPP. Nelson has extensive knowledge on coffee and farming in general, in particular organic farming, and decades of experience as a leading advocate for small farmers. In the Fair Trade Handbook, we're very, very fortunate to have Nelson join us with Joey, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, in this fantastic chapter where the two engage in a dialogue around the importance of decolonization, solidarity, and co-responsibility. And I think it's really an incredible chapter and one that should be read not just by people interested in fair trade, but also global solidarity and development in general. This will be followed by Joey Pituello, the general manager and worker member of Just Us Coffee, a leading Canadian fair trade coffee roaster and worker-owned cooperative in Nova Scotia. Joey's an organic farmer as well. He's performed a range of roles over the years at Just Us, including being a baker, a chocolatier, a coffee roaster, and a director of coffee. In his current role as GM, Joey's particularly responsible for producer relationships. Joey's very well known in the fair trade community in Canada and internationally, and is really a leading advocate for promoting democratic business and the solidarity economy. And I've been fortunate enough to know Joey for many years now. He's kindly come out to SMU, my university, to give talks to my students on many occasions. Joey's very passionate about many things, and he's particularly passionate about the relationship between buyers and producers, about reimagining that relationship in a way that transcends the limits of business as usual. And this can be seen, as I mentioned, in that dialogue chapter with Nelson, which raises so many urgent and important issues. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Roxana Oliveira, a Toronto-based investigative journalist whose work has appeared in numerous media, including CBC, The Huffington Post, The Walrus, El País, New Internationalist, and the United Church Observer. Her work's been published in English, Spanish, and German. Roxana is the recipient of many awards, including the prestigious Al Newharth Innovation in Investigative Journalism Award in 2015 for her joint work with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists on a global investigation into forced evictions financed by the World Bank. I've also been fortunate to know Roxana now for several years and to read her wide-ranging works, which is consistently focused on social justice, the rule of law, and human rights. Roxana is also working on the Spanish translation of the Fair Trade Handbook, along with her colleague Alex Zyman, and we hope to have that out very soon. We're very excited about that. For the handbook, Roxana has written a powerful and tragic tale through the life of Alvaro Vargas Fonseca, a coffee farmer and an undocumented construction worker in Canada. Roxana reveals the grave injustices in the global economy for small farmers and for migrant workers, and urges us to see and confront the terrible consequences of our unequal world.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And so, yes, I think I just have a couple of moments to kind of give a brief introduction. As Gavin said, I'm now the senior copy manager for Fair Trade International, but that comes on a long sort of backdrop working directly with farmers, which is where my head and my heart is. And most recently looking at this crazy injustice, climate injustice, and this lack of support and focus on practical solutions. So one of my main focuses has been like facilitating, identifying real life solutions, working with farmer groups to help showcase their knowledge, their experimentation and their results, and then bringing that out to sort of a learning exchange and more general knowledge. These are, I think, critical for farmers, but also super important for all of us to understand that we have a daily opportunity to make wise choices for our own well-being and the well-being for others and the planet. So I know we have a lot of questions that are going to be specifically focused on that. I hope to bring this perspective of working with farmers also as a co-importer, a green buyer, and now this larger perspective from Fair Trade International of the many moving pieces between advocacy, trading agreements, goodwill, and awareness across the entire supply chain in order to help try and tackle some of these thorny questions about why can't we fix these problems that seem so common sense and really win-win for all. And I'll be looking at that from the context of my experience in coffee. So.
Great. Thank you, Monica. And just a reminder, if your interpretation button changed when we went in the breakout rooms, just make sure to reset it because I'm going to introduce Nelson to just say a few words of introduction.
Hola, buenos días a todos. Qué gusto estar de nuevo con motivo de este gran trabajo, de este hermoso libro. Y yo muy feliz de volverlos a ver a mis compañeros. Y muy feliz de transmitir y de seguir en este trabajo comunitario por el bien de todos. También espero poder contribuir un poco. Como saben, desde octubre del año pasado dejé la presidencia del SPP Global y este tiempo me ha servido también mucho para reflexionar y ver desde la simple posición de un productor más en su finca, todos los días trabajando en las plantas, ver más la realidad y confirmar el trabajo que venimos haciendo desde el SPP Global. Será un gusto compartir estos momentos con todos ustedes.
Thank you so much. Gracias, Nelson. And now we'll go on to Joey.
I don't have much more to say. I think Gavin did a far better job than I would introducing myself. Certainly far more complimentary than I would be, which I appreciate. But I'm really happy to have contributed to this book and really excited to contribute to this panel discussion. Thanks.
Sorry, and of course, last but not least, Roxana, please just introduce yourself for a couple minutes.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Joey. Gavin has pretty much said everything that needs to be said about me. I hate promoting myself. But I think that this is a very interesting book. It really confirms what the process of this investigation. You know, it all started with the story of a farmer, of a construction worker who died here in Canada, and I wanted to know what happened to him. And then that story took me to the story behind the coffee farmers and the coffee that we drink. And then we realized this this interconnection with immigration, with death in the desert and everything else. So I think that this book does a very good job to putting together all those different aspects of what is behind the products that we consume, the people that make them, and the policies that affect these people who work in these horrible conditions that very often are forced to flee their homelands to be able to go to other countries to try to get a fair income for their families. So thank you. I'm very excited to work on the translation of this book as well with my colleague Alex Sisman. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So the format of this is I do have some prepared questions that I'm going to ask the speakers. And if you as an audience member have additional questions that come up as you hear the responses from the speaker, you can feel free to type them in whichever language is better for you in the chat. Gavin will be able to tackle the English questions and read them out. And I might need some help from my other speakers or Spanish speakers to help with any Spanish questions that come in the chat, but definitely want to make this inclusive for everyone. So I'm going to start with a first question for Monica, because Monica, in your chapter, you talk about how caring for the land in traditional ways, such as without use of pesticides, using natural compost, rich in microorganisms, bacteria, and fungi, and resulting in the sequestration of carbon, is a tool for coffee farmers to increase the resilience of their crops. And this seems like common sense because it's been done that way for a lot of time, but apparently it seems like now this doesn't seem to be the norm, given that the conventional way of growing includes great amounts of pesticides and other chemicals. And I'm just wondering, why do you think there was that shift?
Yeah, well, thank you, Erin. And I think I'm going to start with a confession. Well, this is my aha moment. About 10 years ago, I'm standing in the field of a small-scale farmer in Honduras. And this is in the peak of a devastating leaf rust crisis. It's a fungus that's climate change induced, and it destroys the productivity of a tree. It can, depending on the intensity, could kill branches, could damage the harvest, but it can also kill the entire tree. So I'm standing in Oscar Alonso's field. His field is surrounded by this devastation, and he was getting the best productivity, the most green, lush trees I'd ever seen in coffee in some already nearly 25 years experience. And the contrast was mind-boggling, and and it sort of like stopped me dead in my tracks. Like, what is going on here? How is this happening? It was one narrow pathway separating devastation to like flourishing fields. And he starts talking to me about his soil and the microorganisms and the beneficial bacteria and all these things. And I'm just like, what is going on here? Like, I have worked close with organic farmers next to sort of really renowned agronomists for years and years. I facilitated workshops on composting and this, that, and the other thing, but no one had talked to me about why you put dry ingredients in the compost, why you put green, and this life, this biological life that is necessary in soil in order to protect, to make the minerals available and the nutrients available to the root system. Also has this biodiversity within it that also essentially inoculates the trees. And it's like, it is so common sense. And yet we've grown, and this is not new. This is like since, humanity decided that we're separate from nature. But then in addition to this, the Industrial Revolution, and then the post-World War II, and this like boom of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, people, universities, agronomists, farmers, there's learning incentive, there's financial incentive, there's a sort of push to modernization that has distorted this common sense approach to living on the planet. And it's all pushing nature to like extract as much as possible, as opposed to understanding, learning and listening and understanding how can we work with nature? How can we strengthen the forces of nature to everyone's benefit in order to like recover sort of living in this kind of balance? And, you know, I see this as, you know, a curse of our modern era, maybe some kind of a genetic default or defect in the human psyche, that we need to be more powerful than nature and like this need to dominate. But the results have been devastating and they continue to be. And the flip side of that, and I would say that moment also was this huge aha moment for me, and literally has changed my life forever in the way that I even walk on the planet, knowing that under my feet there is so much going on. But getting that mindset into mainstream education, research, promotion, I would say even in the development industry, you know, it's like everyone's looking for a quick fix as opposed to really stepping back and trying to understand this very complicated system. So I think I said enough on this, but there is so much to work with when we make that mind shift and begin to understand. And that's sort of one of my main focuses, continuing in the world of coffee to try and promote more of like that back to an ancestral way of living on the planet, but also with all the research and modern knowledge and tools that we can apply to that to help accelerate a regeneration of like the damage to resources that we've already created. So
yeah, thank you, Monica. Nelson, I wanted to ask, like, were farmers in Colombia already using those similar tactics? Did they have to come to an aha moment, or was that knowledge passed between fair trade cooperatives? How is it in Colombia?
A ver, bueno, ese tema a mí me parece interesante las dos palabras que utilizaba Mónica, de que esto parece el sentido común. Y efectivamente es el sentido común. Recordemos que este tema de los pesticidas y de los químicos en la agricultura entran en 1943, 1960. A Colombia entró en 1962. Y ese es un aporte que le debemos agradecer a la Fundación Rockefeller. Y desde ese entonces, pues entonces esas prácticas tradicionales que tenían nuestros abuelos fueron minimizadas y fueron descartadas de los paquetes tecnológicos. Y desde esa época entonces se habla de que hay que ser competitivos y productivos, y el objetivo era vendernos químicos y vendernos pesticidas. Y hoy, pues como Mónica muy bien lo dice, estamos viendo las consecuencias. Entonces nosotros desde la producción orgánica estamos trabajando en nuestras fincas, recuperando ese conocimiento de nuestros abuelos, ese conocimiento que era ancestral. Antes había una producción de armonía y de equilibrio, y era una producción alegre, viva. La gente vivía bien. Hoy es una producción acelerada, nerviosa, con miedo porque todo tiene que ser rápido, todo tiene que ser competitivo, y es una producción que enferma realizarla y enferma consumirla. Y claro, ¿qué hemos hecho nosotros? Pues nosotros, organizados sobre nuestras cooperativas, nuestras estructuras de producción, empezando por la familiar, pues estamos recuperando esas prácticas y uniéndonos entre los diferentes continentes, conociendo las experiencias como esta que Mónica acaba de compartirnos. Y de paso, gracias Mónica por sus ayudas en mi organización. Y venimos trabajando intensamente porque estamos seguros que hay que recuperarla y que hay que volver hacia ese sistema de producción. Por eso es algo tan importante que yo miro en el SPP, que una de las condiciones para estar dentro de nuestra red SPP es ser productores ecológicos. Entonces, ese es el camino correcto y ese es el camino que hay que seguir y hay que no olvidarse de la historia porque tenemos hoy en las instituciones y en los gobiernos gente joven que nació con este tipo de paquetes tecnológicos y que no conocen lo que era antes los sistemas de producción. Y en esto ha afectado mucho también, pues, los tratados de libre comercio que los países del norte nos han impuesto para entonces poder hacer pues sus negocios de acuerdo a las conveniencias de ellos sin tener en cuenta los efectos negativos que causan en nuestros países.
Thank you. Gracias, Nelson. Maybe following up on that, besides the health of the soil, what else needs to happen? And you touched on this a little bit when you're talking about the trade structures need to change. Do you mind elaborating on what more needs to happen to combat climate change?
Yeah, I might jump in on that. In addition, so the soil is the foundation, but we should remember that coffee actually is a forest shrub. It was discovered in hundreds of years ago, growing wild in the forests of Eastern Africa. And we've taken it out of that context and we've tried to manipulate the genetics of the tree in order to make it survive in full sun. But if we bring back that canopy of layered shade, of a diversity of different types of trees and shade cover, then we are replicating a forest in a time when the entire world is desperately seeking opportunities to reforest the planet. And then also something that is known, but it's a little bit, seems to be difficult to implement, the actual pruning and maintenance of the tree itself. In pruning proactively the tree while it's still young enough, it comes back with a lot of vitality. It increases productivity, but all of that new growth, it's also carbon that's been sequestered from the atmosphere. It's been stored in the trees. And then part of this knowledge sharing goes to then with that trimming, that pruning, that organic waste residue, what are we doing with it? We can't be burning it. We can't be just letting it sort of decay and emit emissions back into the atmosphere. That needs to be managed in a very controlled way. So there are technologies that are showing great promise. Burning, but in a very controlled way, creating biochar, getting that residue back into the soil just accelerates the regeneration of the soil, or you're just mulching and getting that wood residue back into the soil, so the fungus and the bacteria, the microorganisms in soil will actually consume that and keep it stored in soil. So it's just like understanding that interaction with nature it not only brings carbon down from the atmosphere, but then it also creates a much more alive and healthy ecosystem, bringing back the biodiversity and the holding capacity of carbon to kind of become a more intensive climate solution, intensive in a good way.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. In nature, there really is no waste. It's just the waste can be used to regenerate. Nelson, did you want to add anything to what Monica was saying?
Sí, yo pienso que definitivamente pues el precio caro de ese problema, pues quienes más los pagamos y de manera inmediata somos los productores de materias primas, pero al final a todo mundo nos va a llegar la factura por lo que está pasando en el planeta. Y nosotros nos sentimos desde nuestra condición de productores orgánicos, desde cooperativas agremiadas, en función de trabajar no solo por una rentabilidad económica, pues nos sentimos golpeados por tantas normas que no ayudan en nada, por todos los gobiernos de nuestro planeta que son mucho discurso y poca acción. Y entonces nos ha tocado improvisar, porque tristemente, Mónica lo dice, hace 10, 20 años vio los efectos del cambio climático y hasta hoy no hay lineamientos claros en ninguna parte de cómo atenderlo. Entonces nosotros, los productores organizados, estamos basándonos por ese sentido común, por ese compartir que tenemos en el día a día con la naturaleza, para ver cuál es la manera de afrontar esta situación, porque cada quien tiene que hacer lo que le corresponde. Y en este caso, entonces, nosotros venimos hace varios años también hablando de varios temas, de cómo afrontarlo. Por ejemplo, una de las cosas que tenemos claras hoy es que debemos diversificar nuestra producción. Diversificarla y no apostar todo nuestro esquema económico hacia un solo producto. También debemos tener en cuenta que la variación climática genera unas reacciones en las plantas y entonces si tenemos semillas que no están adaptadas para esas variaciones, pues vamos a estar en condición desfavorable. Y por eso estamos trabajando en cómo protegemos esas semillas que de alguna manera se vienen acondicionando a la realidad actual de nuestro clima. Hemos aprendido que debemos aprender a manejar más la información climática. Debemos empezar a registrar qué pasa en la noche, qué pasa en la mañana con las temperaturas, con el agua, porque uno de los efectos que nos está golpeando mucho es que son temperaturas altas y temperaturas bajas, o mucha lluvia o poca lluvia, y eso tenemos que aprender a manejarlo. Y entonces lo mismo tenemos que hacer con el agua. Hoy tenemos épocas muy secas y épocas de abundante agua, y tenemos que aprender a tener agua cuando no la tenemos a disposición de la naturaleza normalmente, para poder utilizarla y para minimizar el impacto de las épocas secas. Y también es importantísimo trabajar en una cosa. En cada finca, en cada cuenca, debemos generar microclimas. Y una de las acciones fundamentales para lograrlo es los árboles, como efectivamente lo manifestaba Mónica. Los árboles son una maravilla. Yo les pregunto, ¿quién ha visto una montaña enferma? Usted entra a una montaña y usted respira tranquilidad, oxígeno puro, usted ve el equilibrio. Y eso es lo que tenemos que hacer nosotros en nuestras unidades de producción. Tratar de establecer unos sistemas forestales que nos permitan desarrollar las actividades agrícolas que necesitamos hacer. En esas nuevas estrategias nosotros venimos trabajando. Hay un tema que es muy delicado y que tiene que ver con la participación de los jóvenes en todo esto. Nosotros de alguna manera ya hicimos lo bien o lo mal que pudimos hacer, pero ya necesitamos que los jóvenes se apropien de la responsabilidad de su mundo, porque algunos dejaremos de existir y ellos deberán seguir al frente. Y uno ve con preocupación que las dinámicas de los jóvenes no están centradas debidamente hacia la protección del ambiente. ¿Por qué? Porque desafortunadamente en los colegios, en los medios de comunicación, el mensaje más fuerte que se les envía es el consumismo. y entonces ellos, es lógico que tienen un problema muy difícil, que es luchar contra ese consumismo al cual todo este mercado global nos está llevando. Y ahí se hace necesario enfilar muchas energías para que los jóvenes puedan asumir la responsabilidad que les toca. Mal o bien, nosotros hemos hecho algo, pero ellos son los que van a seguir habitando este planeta y deben asumir y se deben hacer estrategias más contundentes, más concretas para que los jóvenes ingresen en ese tema y le hagan frente. Eso quisiera comentar al respecto.
Gracias, Nelson. Yeah, the young people, that's a real a threat if they're not involved to our food security. And climate change is something that's happening worldwide. And I'm curious, this question is for Monica and Joey. How are these same sorts of thoughts and issues and tactics being done in Canada, in North America? Are farmers, I assume that they're encountering the same challenges, and do you have a sense for whether people are trying these same tactics in North America?
I'm gonna jump in, Joey, or shall I? I'll just say very quickly, I know for a fact Regeneration Canada, it's made up primarily of young and less young farmers who are attempting to implement all these types of practices. And they're also finding it a very challenging uphill battle because there's so few institutional supports and both research, investment, it's geared to scale and not geared to this kind of experimentation to find localized results and new approaches and combined approaches in order to like produce in a much more sustainable way. Joy, I know you're linked to farmer communities out in Nova Scotia. I don't know if you've got some very particular observations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say that certainly it's definitely applicable to all crops. And in particular, like one of the things that strikes me is we're talking a lot about coffee, which is a perennial kind of an agroforestry model, which even in its worst form is probably less devastating on the soil than annual crop production is. Things like wheat and rye and other grains and oil crops, which get turned over every single year. And every time they get turned over, essentially the oxygen combined with that organic carbon in the soil and water and everything else turns it into carbon dioxide again, and it goes into the atmosphere. And it's a big challenge. And Monica mentioned regenerative, and organic regenerative agriculture is a really important field everybody's getting into. But once again, one of the challenges is the conventional sector trying to co-opt that particular movement. So we hear a lot about regenerative these days, and often it means no-till methods. But what they do is they use herbicides to kill off the plants and not have to till. And so it turns into yet another, big business kind of a game. And this is the challenge, I think. Governments have been struggling to comprehend how agriculture can be part of the solutions for climate change. I think they mostly start to see it as a necessary cost, and they worry about affecting the big industrial machine that's been created around agriculture and how many jobs and how much money is created, or circulated because of these industries. But the reality is that it has a big part to play. Sequestered carbon is a huge potential asset when it comes to how agriculture can contribute to climate mitigation issues. And so, for example, there's Farmers for Climate Change here in Canada that's been it's been in place for about 2 or 3 years now. It's kind of a network, a coalition of organizations. Just Us, we were helped kind of support the creation of a provincial organic agriculture organization here in the province of Nova Scotia, and we're part of that coalition of the Farmers for Climate Solutions here in Canada. And for the first time, we're seeing some actual traction at the federal level around some of these more responsible and more ecologically supportive agricultural techniques. But, you know, here in Nova Scotia, as we try to implement those, we approach farmers I just tell you a quick, it's just a kind of anecdotal thing. I was out for a walk here where I live in Grand Pré, Nova Scotia, and it's a beautiful place. Lots of agriculture, lots of dike land created by French settlers back in the, in the early 1600s, 1700s in that area, and they really opened up tons of area for agriculture. And I know a number of farmers out here. I was out for a walk and I ran into one of them, and they were out clearing some land, and I got into a conversation with them about we've got about 14 acres on our farm, and we've got quite wet soil where we are. I think we've got a spring at the top of a hill that then just kind of flows its way down, which is a lovely thing, except in the spring and early summer when it's really hard to get on the soil. But also we've had the soil use a lot of cover crops. We use a lot of pasture as a means of incorporating organic matter into our soil. We've increased the organic matter on our soil, on our land, in our soil, by about 2% in the last 6 or 7 years. So it started off somewhere in the 1.5% range. It was pretty much absent of it. A lot of corn had been grown on it, and it's really destructive kind of agricultural practice. Anyway, I was talking about the wet soil that I have on my property with this farmer, conventional farmer, dairy farmer here, great person. He said, "Oh yeah, you got all that wet because you've got all that pasture land and it's all grass, and that organic matter holds onto the water so much. You got to rip that up, tear it up every year. You burn all that off, and you'll have drier soils in the spring." And this is a neighbor of mine, and so we got into a little conversation about what the organic matter does. It certainly does keep water in the soil, and that's a kind of important thing. But we certainly agreed to disagree a little bit, and we did so respectfully. But it really demonstrated to me the challenge we have. These techniques are these are traditional. This is somebody in his 50s, been farming for decades. His family has been they're planters originally, so they were Americans that came up, English settlers basically came up from the States back in the 1700s, took over some of the Acadian farms. And, this is kind of how things have evolved. Certainly wasn't always that way, but, in the last, obviously, 60, 70 years with kind of post-war industrial machine has created these ways of doing things. And it's a very challenging scenario. And I think that it's slow in our part of the world. There's other parts of the world that move a little more differently. But there's no question that the impact we could make if we were able to convert a majority of conventional farmers to these more ecological methods. But it's an uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. That's an interesting perspective. And everyone has their own lens and comes from what they know. And so it sometimes takes a few more conversations to get people to see the other point of view. I'd like to go to Roxana, because Roxana, you wrote a really interesting chapter about an invisible farmer who turns into an undocumented construction worker. And I'm really curious to hear from you. How did you hear about that story, and why did you write about that story?
Thank you, Erin, for that question. I learned about his story through an article in a newspaper, and that was published in the Globe and Mail in 2008. And according to that article, Alvaro had died at a construction site in Toronto, and his landlady was having trouble getting his body to Costa Rica, where he was from. I learned that he was 38 years old and that he was undocumented. But as I read the article, I realized I began to wonder about Alvaro's life. Who was he? What had brought him to Canada? And why wasn't his employer paying for his body to be transported to Costa Rica? Or for that matter, why wasn't the Costa Rican consulate involved in this? Or the Canadian government? Why is nobody responsible for getting these remains to Costa Rica instead of his landlady? Canadian immigration, we hear we are more than willing to deport individuals who are undocumented, and here we have someone who presumably is undocumented according to the article, and yet we're having difficulty trying to get this body home. So I started to wonder about him, and I wanted to find out about what was the reaction of his family, how did they learn about this, and all those, just human, just interest in this human being. And the more I started digging, I realized that there was a hidden story behind this. The people who were interviewed for this article, for instance, claimed not to know much about him, even though they had been trying to get money to get money together so that they can send the body home. And I realized, well, how could you forget about this? And anyways, I started to just trying to find out what exactly. And the more blocks I encounter along the road, the more I became determined to find out what happened to this individual. And eventually, it was those questions that took me to Costa Rica to meet his family. And this was done while I was doing research at Osgood Hall Law School. I was a journalist in residence there, and I proposed this as a mini project so that I could travel with a student, a law student, to try to find out about this. And we realized that there were so many stories: immigration, human rights, trade. There were so many questions about this, and it was through this work that I was very fortunate to meet Gavin. I didn't know, when I got to Costa Rica, I realized that there was a story related to coffee, and I couldn't understand. People were leaving. I said, why? They said, because of the coffee crisis. What coffee crisis? I have not heard about the coffee crisis. And then I started looking into it, and then I realized that it wasn't just Alvaro, there were many, many other people who had left because of the coffee crisis. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, and I really encourage people, if you haven't read the book or the chapter of that book, it was really just incredible, like the can of worms that you open just by looking at one piece of the story and finding out there's all these different ripple effects of what's been happening in other areas of his life that have led to, unfortunately, a very sad ending. My question for Nelson is, how has the coffee crisis affected farmers in Colombia? Do you see similar stories happening with farmers having to leave Colombia to make a better living?
Bueno, yo me voy a centrar un poco en el tema del comercio justo y un poco en el tema de los sistemas de producción, porque las migraciones en Colombia para los cafeteros tienen también otras raíces crueles, pero voy a tratar de enfocarme solo en eso. Pues sí, acá hemos visto muchas migraciones de productores cafeteros, y una de esas grandes migraciones precisamente la causó esta introducción de este paquete tecnológico altamente dañino para la Tierra, para el planeta. Son paquetes tecnológicos muy costosos que las instituciones han promovido siempre hasta hoy, pese a que no hay insumos por todo lo que sabemos de lo que está pasando en el planeta, en el mundo, y los insumos químicos están muy costosos, pero las instituciones hoy en día siguen hablando de lo mismo. Entonces, en el gremio cafetero se sigue recomendando la urea, el triple 15, cantidad de productos que están muy costosos. Entonces, ese paquete tecnológico fue el primero que sacó a los productores pequeños de café de muchas de sus fincas, porque no alcanzaban a implementarlo, y entonces se vuelve para ellos un negocio poco productivo, y entonces muchos de ellos, sobre todo en el eje cafetero de Colombia, tuvieron que vender sus fincas Y hoy esas fincas son de médicos, de ingenieros, de gente empresarial que tiene la capacidad y no tiene problema en invertir muchos millones en ese tema, pero aún así es tan crítica la situación que entonces hoy el eje cafetero de este país, el antiguo eje cafetero de este país, hoy el gobierno lo ha apoyado para que sea una zona de turismo. Entonces viene mucha gente a pasearse por las fincas y todo, y el tema del café, de los pequeños productores, pues ha quedado en un segundo plano. Sin embargo, nosotros como organizaciones agremiadas en el SPP y uno de los compromisos que tenemos es la producción orgánica, pues venimos frenteando y demostrando resultados, porque podemos mostrar resultados positivos frente a este problema. Entonces, yo creo que una de las cosas que debe existir, hablando únicamente en el marco del comercio, pues creo que hay un papel importante que los gobiernos pueden desarrollar para actuar de verdad frente a este problema. Y otra cosa que creo que nosotros que estamos metidos en el comercio justo debemos revisar es que el comercio justo de veras tiene que actuar no como una ONG, sino como lo que debe ser un comercio justo, porque tristemente hoy ve uno que el comercio justo se está volviendo como una ONG, un poco de funcionarios y los productores igual atrás, y es un comercio justo que no aplica mucho para todos en la cadena, casi que se hace lo que los compradores digan, y si ellos están de acuerdo, pues funciona, si ellos no funciona. Entonces creo que ahí debemos actuar más contundente, porque en la actualidad tenemos a los consumidores confundidos y eso es delicado.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting to hear from you, Nelson. I'm actually going to go to Joey because I was wondering if you could comment on, a little bit of what Nelson was saying, in the fact that maybe fair trade is not reflecting small producers' voice. I know that Just Us wants to put small producers' voice at the forefront, and maybe even this can touch on the question that was in the chat about, school kids who would like to understand fair trade a bit more, because obviously we want to present some solutions for how consumers can really have some certainty that what they're buying is putting the producer's voice at the center of the product.
Yeah, no, it's a really complex situation to talk about, and it's hard to break it down, but I think that, and I'm certainly not the best to break it all down, but I think, one of the things that I do notice is that, I think we have a bit of a brand image challenge in terms of, I think particularly in the growing segment of consumers, there seems to be a disconnect between, we talk a lot about certification, fair trade certification, and certification, for one thing, isn't a particularly exciting thing to talk about. I mean, nobody really jumps up and down when they've got to talk about certification, right? And I think the challenge we have is with the global trade system, you basically replace trust with a certification system. This kind of, you go, if you want to go buy some vegetables down the road at the farmer's market, you know the person, you can go visit their farm, you can talk with them, you get to know them, you understand their values, and you can make a judgment call. When we're talking about commodity products that are coming from all around the world, you can't just go over. Like I've been fortunate and privileged myself to go and visit Nelson, see his farm, but of course the vast majority of consumers can't do that, and so you end up replacing it with a bit of a, this is what it's become, certification. And I think it's a bit of it can be a very oppressive instrument if it's not done properly, if it's not, if we don't focus on the more important things and use it as certainly it's a tool, we need the certification piece. But I think it can become oppressive. And I think Nelson even talk about this a little bit previously, in that, in organic certifications, even more so sometimes, in that, they get right into the details of how you need to farm your land. And as small producers who've been doing it ecologically for a long time, worrying about all these check marks on a list of things to do can be a very oppressive way to be in partnership, quote unquote, with small producers. So I think it's really important, that we need to take a good hard look at the fair trade movement generally, and how deeply rooted it can be in Western and ultimately, colonial ideas and mindsets and patterns of thought. And, it can fall victim to the same one-dimensional sensibilities that any, trade system, like that our conventional one can, right? We've got to be careful about this conversation around, this culture of productivity and efficiency, getting good value for our money. It's kind of counter to the more balanced approach you see small producers take in their everyday. They're speaking more to the ideas of community, family, the ecology around them, the place that they are part of. They're one of the organisms in their place where they live. And they see this as a much more valuable and important thing to consider than these more oppressive kind of productivity regime approaches that we have in the global north and with Western thought. So, I think that's when I hear Nelson speak as he's just spoke, I think a lot about that connection that people have with the land, and how the mindsets can be different. The global trade system is really based on this productivity and efficiency. And we, if we're not careful within the fair trade movement, we live in this space of these particular patterns of thought and behavior, and it's not easy to separate. It's the whole, the decolonization conversation really is, it's pervasive here. And in the end, I think there are also ways that we can connect it to what's going on here, like in particular our neck of the woods. We've got Glooscap First Nation, a Mi'kmaq community, and Annapolis Valley First Nation a little bit further down the valley. We had them both here. We invited them over to meet with our management team a couple days ago to talk about the products that we sell, fair trade. We're doing a new fair trade museum we're trying to create here that focuses on the fair trade as a tool for decolonization. And we it was really great to sit down and talk about some of the products that we do, that we sell, that are for Indigenous owned businesses, and how you can there's an opportunity there here locally for us to connect the concept of fair trade and decolonization that needs to go on right here where I'm sitting, with what's going on in the fair trade movement and small Indigenous and peasant producers in the global South. And, making those connections, those real potentially personal connections, and building those relationships is a really neat opportunity that I think fair trade could, both engage in a domestic conversation around, while connecting it to the broader context and the broader practices and trade routes that we have set up globally. Anyway, sorry to go on that, but it's a complicated one, and it's certainly a number of us could probably speak for hours on end on this particular issue. But
yeah, no, and I appreciate, we had so much that we wanted to cover in this session, and unfortunately we're running out of time. But I think what I'd like to do as a bit of a wrap up is have a round table for each speaker, just to spend 2 minutes maybe just summarizing. And I want to end on a positive note. So please tell me, what is your biggest hope for the future? And I'm going to start with Roxana.
That's fine. I said, well, it's hard to be positive right now in this chapter because there is so much, and there are so many deaths. Perhaps one of the positive aspects of this is to have this type of discussions where we can tackle these problems and identify what is at the root of the problem that causes all these migrants to leave, and all these dead bodies to lay scattered in the invisible in the Arizona desert, for just volunteers from with the Colibri project or the missing migrants project, ready to identify and rescue these individuals from their invisibility status, if you will. So I think that the positive aspect of all this is to understand, try to get to understand that we need to make long-lasting changes as a nation in our immigration policy, for instance, so that we don't treat migrant workers as mere commodities, but rather as real human beings. And these kind of exchanges, this type of book, puts us all together from different parts of the world, from different lenses, if you will, to come and tackle these problems. So hopefully we'll be able to find a solution or become a force for change. That's my take.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you hit it on the head. That's really why we want to keep having these types of webinars and discussion, is we need to just think of these solutions together and do what we each can in our own respective way. I'll turn it over to Monica next.
Okay, thanks. Well, I would say from a coffee industry perspective, I see an incredible shift in language where there is more and more talk about living income for farmers, livelihood, environmental, destruction. I think that's a starting point. Definitely, we're not out of the woods because we have to turn that language into clear and collaborative and constructive action that actually puts the farmer first. But I think some of that is coming from growing awareness. Some of that is coming from pure panic, because we are running out of time, and we're seeing it in productivity. We're seeing it in droughts and floods. We're seeing it in all kinds of different ways, and human loss of life, environmental loss of life, and all kinds of species extinction that is actually critical for our own livelihood and our own survival as the human species on the planet. And I am hopeful that through that we are seeing a greater willingness to explore more collaborative solutions. I personally feel like the coffee industry is a great model to make polluters pay, importers, traders, roasters, consumers, understanding that we love this product. We need to love the farmer, and we need to love the planet and the land that makes all of this possible. And we need to be transferring resources, knowledge, financial sort of empathy back downstream or back upstream to where the action happens, where the hard work is really happening, and really acknowledge that shifting papers is not the same as planting, growing, tending, harvesting, hauling coffee. This income shift has to happen. So there is a new dialogue happening, which does make me hopeful. And like I say, there's a lot of heavy lifting that still has to happen in order to make this real.
Thank you, Monica. Over to you, Joey.
I guess I'll say that I'm really hopeful when I witness lived experience becoming a more and more sought after source of knowledge in our communities and in our societies. And I think that's a key piece moving forward as we talk about, the small producer and engaging with the farmer and giving them, kind of putting them in the driver's seat, so to speak. We need to sit and we need to trust in their knowledge and their lived experience and allow them to lead this process more than we have historically. And I think, again, it comes down to decolonization and that whole process. And really, the more we can trust in those lived experiences, of people involved in the fair trade movement at the origins of the products themselves, in the lands where these products come from, I think the more hope I see. Thanks.
And last but not least, Nelson, what are your hopes for the future?
Mire, nosotros tenemos, como lo dice Joy, venimos haciendo un gran trabajo desde este grupo de organizaciones que desde hace algunos años, ya más de 16, nos propusimos crear una red de productores en el mundo del comercio justo, donde el SPP pues está dirigida por y desde los productores, y estamos contentos con el ejemplo que estamos dando. Estamos luchando fuertemente, aunque debo reconocer que si bien es cierto que hay la gran mayoría de compradores dentro del SPP trabajan en esa dinámica que acaba de plantear Joy, también tenemos dificultades porque hay grandes compradores que es su preocupación, sus metas, sus resultados, y ven al SPP como una oportunidad, pero no se siente de veras el compromiso que de veras el comercio justo debe tener. Entonces, de acuerdo con el tema que planteaba antes los compañeros que me antecedieron sobre que hay que tener cuidado con las certificaciones. Y creo que entonces nos queda la esperanza del trabajo que estamos haciendo, donde nosotros somos generadores de nuestras propias capacidades y de apropiarnos cada día más de los procesos y de los mercados. Y tenemos que tener mucho cuidado también con los compradores que nos involucramos, porque pueden ser delicados en el sentido de que pueden dar un mal ejemplo y de pronto el trabajo que los productores estamos haciendo se pueda ver empañado. El mercado es una cosa sin alma, y lo que queremos en el comercio justo es ponerle alma, y no es fácil. Entonces, estamos contentos con el ejemplo que venimos mostrando en la realidad, y seguimos comprometidos por un beneficio para todos, y ojalá podamos enamorar a muchos más compradores que piensen como nosotros, que piensen que el beneficio no solo son los resultados empresariales, sino el equilibrio que necesitamos todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Nelson, for those closing remarks. So I'm going to go into just a bit of fun time. I know we only have a few minutes left, but we have a trivia challenge, and we're not doing this as high tech. So it really, the question is written in the chat, and if you can just put in the chat what you think your answer is. It's really just fun. There's no prize for getting it right or wrong, but try to guess some of these questions, just a little bit of an interactive aspect so that people can have a bit of fun. We did do a draw for a fair trade book. So some lucky winner will get a fair trade handbook. And that person, I just did a random number generator, and Tiffany Lee, if you are on the call, you have won a copy of the Fair Trade Handbook. So I hope, is Tiffany on the call?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
I was just typing in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to get your address and be able to mail that to you. I'm going to put another trivia question quickly in the chat. Some of these are going to be pretty easy for some folks. The answer to the first question was 2004, for those of you who didn't know. So just some fun trivia. And I've tried to put the English and the Spanish in there so that people have a chance to see both. The Spanish is right after the English. This one should be easy because there's a big announcement about this new fruit. It should have the Spanish right after so everyone can read. This is, and like I said, this should be an easy one for most people who are aware of what's happening in the fair trade community, especially Fair Trade Month. We've had some pretty exciting announcements happen around this type of fruit. So everybody should know that it is bananas. Next question. Sorry, I'm not giving you very much time to actually put your answers in the chat, but this is another one that may be very obvious for some people. Other people who don't live in Canada might not know this. The first fair trade town in Canada to become a fair trade town. Oh, looks like a lot of people know this answer. That's awesome. I'm going to type in another one. And yeah, some people who are in Canada might not know the answer, or who don't live in Canada might not know the answer for this one. This might be, you might think this is a bit of a trick question too. Okay, people are catching on. It's actually E. You can actually find all 4 of those types of products as fair trade: roses, soccer balls, gold, cotton. In Canada, you can find them as fair trade. And last but not least, and this one might be another obvious one, but it's good to, the small producers are an incredible organization doing a lot of great work. You may not be aware of all the different facets that they are involved in. Through this multiple choice, you may be led to think that they maybe only do some of the things listed there, but it's actually all of the above. And I apologize, I didn't have the answers of that question translated into Spanish, but slowing climate change, food sovereignty, incorporating young people's perspective, as you heard a lot from Nelson on crafting high quality products. Really, it is all of the above that the small producers are doing in their good work. So thank you. I know we are 1 minute over, but thank you all for joining us today. Congratulations to Tiffany who won our prize. Thank you, everyone. And stay tuned because we hope to have a webinar series session 2 in September and session 3 in November of this year. So stay tuned to hear from more incredible authors from the Fair Trade Handbook. Know that we have exhausted our first printing of the Fair Trade Handbook and had to do a second printing, which is awesome. Please continue to advertise it to your networks and encourage people to read the book and read section 2 before September, and you will meet some exciting new people from that chapter of those chapters of the book. Thank you.